Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Matthew Harrison, and I'm speaking to you today from the heart of Canada. I have no guest today, but have prepared a little something to talk to you about. Donald Trump is the Republican nominee for the American presidential election. On July 13th, an assassination attempt was made on Donald Trump's life. The bullet fired by the 20-year-old would-be assassin missed Donald Trump's head by centimeters, clipping his ear. Sunday the 21st, President Joe Biden withdrew from the 2024 election. Joe Biden, it was announced, has decided to step aside and allow another candidate to run for the Democrat ticket in the 2024 election. Who will be selected remains to be seen, but Biden, in a separate statement given shortly after he announced his resignation, endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris. The last 2 weekends have done more than enough to stir the pot of political discourse, leaving plenty to talk about. But today, I'll spare exploring too much and stay on track today, talking about the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. The attempt on Donald Trump's life on Saturday the 13th created an extraordinary amount of conspiracy theories within minutes. I was at a barbecue when we all saw the breaking news, and within 10 minutes, someone at the barbecue said it was a staged shooting that Trump was going to use for self-promotion. There was no evidence, no information of what really happened, but the conspiracy, that particular one, has gained plenty of support online from thousands of people. When he got up off the stage and pumped his fist in the air, yelling, "Fight, fight, fight" to the crowd with blood on his face, it seemed too cinematic to be real. In the days since, there is no sign of his ear, what condition it's in, but many remain skeptical that he was ever actually shot. On the flip side of the argument are Trump supporters, many of whom quickly took to blaming, in general terms, the left. Some have also suggested the Secret Service were accomplices, accounting for their poor reaction at the event. While many conspiracy theories are circulating, countless many are pointing the blame at Democrats, at what many have called the dangerous leftist agenda, a key phrase of the modern Republican Party. A few days after the shooting, on a university campus in Winnipeg, I and a few others were speaking with a professor after the class about the events of the weekend. One student, a vocal supporter of Donald Trump, told us about how this was a left-leaning person who did it. After all, he said, the shooter had donated money to the Democrats and was a registered Republican only to veil his support for Joe Biden, and the shooter had in fact voted for Biden. I was quick to respond because the reality was, especially 3 days after the shooting, when this conversation took place, no information was available about the shooter beyond what people who knew him from high school had shared to news outlets. The money he donated was $15 he made in high school to a Democrat-aligned organization. Beyond that, to suggest he was registered as a Republican strategically as a smokescreen to deter attention from his alleged actual political lean is a fictional narrative likely made up by a Republican thinker this classmate subscribes to. This is the epitome of what drives Donald Trump to political success, showing that reality and truth are not as important as who is speaking. To see in real time the repetition of baseless information in an academic environment was jarring. We are taught in academia to accurately cite our sources, to base our information in reliable sources, but this individual, someone who has been in university more than 4 years, would rather follow the fictional breadcrumbs laid down by their favorite right-wing pundit than use critical thinking to assess what information is actually available. They would rather believe the lie than consider the reality that no such information was remotely available beyond fictional conspiracies. This is Trumpism, baseless conspiracies distributed at such a rate that they can't all possibly be researched by his followers. Trump is a master of creating narratives that cause people to feel afraid and as though he has the answers and that he will help keep people safe. The answer, oftentimes, is that those who oppose him are the enemy. The message he delivers is, if they're coming for me today, they'll come for you tomorrow. Now, what created this environment for his thought process in modern America and, to a certain degree, in Canada? How did we get here? Many blame leftist thinking, and a modern phenomenon of cancel culture was swept through academia and made its way into workplaces and politics. There was a time, and to a certain degree remains a feeling, where many people felt like they were no longer allowed to express certain opinions or disagree with certain ideas. Such ideas include values of same-sex marriage, transgender rights, anti- or pro-choice rights, perspectives on immigration, or affirmative action. Since 2010, Canada and the United States have taken large steps socially, many of which have strong support, but also comes with many who disagree. What are we to do when we face such immense disagreements? Ultimately, we have to coexist somehow, and really, the differences of our ideas and our opinions is a large part of what makes this part of the world unique. We are a collection of different cultures, and that will inherently create disagreement. We need to accept these disagreements in a civil manner. This, I feel, is where the seeds of what eventually motivated Donald Trump's political success were sown. When these social issues became often discussed and widely promoted, there was little room left for discourse. Much of what has been forward socially in the last 15 years has been great, and I support anyone who identifies in a variety of gender definitions, to love people of all genders freely, to express their faith as they choose, and to come to Canada in order to start a new life. I support these things wholeheartedly. But what was lost along the way was room for discourse. I personally had many questions when transgender rights became a front page topic because I had never been taught such things. But despite the support I have for the movement, I felt afraid to ask questions for fear of offending people. I knew people personally who were better informed, but they were very quick to anger when I asked questions, and others stopped speaking to me or walked away from conversations when I asked questions. I had no malintent, I only wanted to understand this different perspective. I say this to propose the idea that this is where a political divide became a chasm. These are definitely sensitive topics, but when dissenting ideas were proposed, even in academia where ideas are meant to be explored, individuals were labeled as bigoted and people were claimed to be canceled. It felt for years that many topics were legitimately off the table of discussion and that social movements were taking place that all must accept without questions, or else you will be canceled or shamed or accused of being transphobic or racist. This sentiment, this idea that you must obey with no questions asked, is not healthy regardless of the subject matter. Dialogue is the antidote to ignorance, and when ignorance is called bigotry, discourse is avoided and the divide grows. This is when the far right began to grow, and why Donald Trump, the man who says and does whatever he wants, became the flag to bear. When disagreement about an unfamiliar idea becomes reason enough to write someone off or call them out and get them fired from their workplace, or at least try, we allowed a culture of acceptance to become one of accusations, that individuals aren't doing enough, that we must accept ideas we never heard of, and that anything less or otherwise is dangerous and hateful. I want to emphasize again, for fear of being labeled as any kind of phobic or resistant to understanding the perspective of others, that I am very much a supporter of anyone's lifestyle, so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. My continual repetition of this somewhat articulates the dialogue I am referring to. I had a conversation with an older person. They're in their 80s now, and we were talking about a lot of social changes they've experienced in their lifetime, and particularly in the last 20 years, and I found their perspective very interesting. He said he has had plenty of times in his life where he really had to look at himself and admit he is wrong, and that he has to change the way he sees the world. The world will continue to change, he said, and it's up to me to adapt. He has stepped outside his comfort zone many times throughout his life, furthering his understanding of the people in this great country. What he said is, he's seen in the last 10 years, he described it as a lack of patience. He had heard of transgender people, in other terms, but he was aware of the idea, but he did not know it was so prevalent. He described the quick-to-judge mentality of labeling people prejudiced for not adopting fast enough or changing their perspective fast enough. Rather than giving people time to learn, he said, people were expected to accept it as soon as they heard about it. Otherwise, they risked being ostracized. It is not to suggest that information and rational, calm conversations will get every person to support modern social movements, but it is the approach I have taken every time I come across someone who thinks differently on such topics. It will do neither of us any good to simply say that the person who believes something differently than me is a bad person for not understanding, and that they deserve to be cast to the social fringes until they agree with me. When people are villainized rather than spoken to, we need to understand we are actively creating an us and them mentality on both sides. This is where Donald Trump fits the role perfectly. He was the man who stepped up, ready to show the world that ignorance and hateful rhetoric can get you to the top. He came out swinging at his opponents, telling jokes about how he prefers war heroes who weren't captured the way John McCain was while he served in Vietnam, a war Donald Trump himself lived through but did not fight in. Hateful, angry people exist in this world, but by rampantly categorizing more people in this group than actually exists, we've created a group of others out of millions of people rather than encouraging conversation. It is important to mention that I do recognize there is absolutely a massive proportion of people who do not believe in the rights of the LGBTQ2S+ community, and that no amount of dialogue will convince some of these people that trans or gay people deserve rights. There are some people who are simply immovable on these topics. But ultimately, dialogue is the only way out of these situations, either way. I spoke for 20 minutes with a pro-life supporter on the corner of Portage and Memorial, and the conversation never escalated to a shouting match. It never had either us accusing one another of being something or thinking something other than what we had each stated, and the conversation ultimately ended with the two of us disagreeing, shaking hands, and wishing each other a nice day. I didn't want to take any of his pamphlets, but I heard his perspective, and he heard mine. And this is no small topic for either of us, but a conversation was had, and ideas were exchanged in a genuine and honest way. This is what we have lost. It is so much easier to say someone is hateful or bigoted than it is to sit down and have a civil conversation. When we villainize the other, we don't realize just how much of an us and them situation we are creating. And what that leads to is the other side. Those who we have villainized and cast out of our social discourse, they will ultimately villainize us. They will see us as dangerous. Donald Trump filled a void in politics where many felt they were being excluded. Along the way, he became a representation of values he himself may not even hold. His rhetoric is typically about how great he will make the country and how important church and God are, despite showing little association with any church other than selling Trump-approved God Loves the USA Bibles for $60 American. He's the voice of anyone who will vote for him, ready to say anything they want to hear. So long as he is not on the left, the so-called judgmental, hateful, dangerous left, he will have the vote of tens of millions. Donald Trump became the opposition to what so many saw as a harmful wing of ideology, which targeted particular individuals, those who would not change their perspective. This narrative is a natural progression of having labeled disagreement as hate. He is what many to believe to be free speech incarnate. This person from the classroom, who's so quick to spread the baseless conspiracies he had likely found promoted by his favorite pundit on Twitter, early on said he felt as though he was unable, as a conservative, to share his ideas in a university setting. He felt as though he was ostracized and often judged. I do not agree with the politics of this individual, and I disagree most strongly with the manner he decides what sources of information are valid, but I do not disrespect him when we talk in class, and I'm open to hearing his ideas. To hear his politics and determine all his ideas as moot and baseless is to discredit the whole of the man based on who he would vote for in another country's election. Granted, I can't expect us to get along too well over a dinner table, and we might and likely do disagree on plenty, perhaps even most things, but that does not give me the right to villainize this person. I will listen to him, but I will disagree. When the time is appropriate or necessary, I voice my disagreement in as articulate and respectful way as possible, because if I am disagreed with, I would expect the same respect. This respect for different ideas has been lost in this era of wearing our politics on our sleeve. So why do people up here in Canada support Donald Trump? It is because they have been tossed out of discourse by many who are unwilling to listen. I'll not defend much of what others have to say, but I will defend the right to say it without being vaulted into a label of good or bad. We're too complex to sum each other up that simply. I'm firm in my beliefs for equal rights to love and am respectful when challenged. I have my boundaries for when I am no longer willing to engage in a conversation, when someone begins to use derogatory terms or speak down to people with different lifestyles than their own, but I will listen and I will offer my perspective as they offer their own. The internet plays a large role here. We have been given the tools to cut out all differing opinions and subscribe to hundreds of people who sing the same key as us, creating an endless echo chamber where we are only ever told what we want to hear and what we already agree with. When we encounter differing opinions, we can either unsubscribe or blast 280 characters of hateful disagreement in their general direction. There's no verbal response, no recognition that we're sending this to another person. We collect in patches of groupthink, closing off open-minded conversation with those who see the world differently. We're collectively worse for this. These groups, as has been seen many times, only furthered the divide by making villains of each other. And beyond that, it also furthers the divide by ramping up the same speak. If I'm only talking to people who fully agree with me, well, they're only going to encourage me to think that thing more or to a greater extent. Progressive policies and ideas are a good thing, but any idea can be taken too far. Any mentality can be taken too far. And without any differing opinions in the room, we run the risk on both sides of the aisle. It's clearest to see today when we look south of the border that when we allow individuals to collectively disagree with, let's say, the legitimacy of the last two elections, 2020 in particular, we see how harmful that this groupthink can become. We see how harmful it is to have these echo chambers, and we see how dangerous it can be For example, the insurrection on January 6th took place with a bunch of individuals who, without a doubt, do not subscribe to anybody who is remotely left-leaning. These were individuals who encouraged each other, who allowed themselves to feed only off energy of Trump has been robbed. And with no one to disagree or to explain a different perspective of what had happened in the election, there was no reason not to act the way they had on January 6th. These echo chambers have created ample feeding grounds for conspiracies and outright false narratives. We have allowed ourselves in many ways to collectively be guided by the dictation of others rather than exploring information on our own. We see this in every echo chamber, but presently seemingly most harmful one is Donald Trump's Republican Party. What makes him so dangerous is not just his ideas, but his refusal to accept the legitimate outcome of federal elections. This brings me to my main concern and the point of greatest confusion as to why so many, particularly so many in Canada, support his every move. The presidential election is slated for November 8th, 2024, and Donald Trump will, regardless of the results, say as a matter of fact that he has won the 2024 election. If he wins, he will celebrate, but if he loses, he will not accept the results as having been legitimate. He's already done it twice. In 2016, while touring the country on a victory tour, he could not help himself from arguing that the election was rigged. Many argue that this is simply a result of having lost the popular vote. Meanwhile, he won the Electoral College. It seems as though he just wasn't able to accept that more people voted for Hillary Clinton, even though he won. What Trump had the last time he was in office, from 2016 until 2020, was a team of people who were Republicans. Many have said that they stayed in that office to keep him from doing unconscionable things, such as his former Vice President Mike Pence, who refused to follow orders when told to reject Electoral College votes, which decided the election, surrendering the presidency of Trump. In an interview with Fox, Pence said, quote, "I think it's important that the American people know what happened in the days before January 6th. President Trump demanded that I use my authority as vice president presiding over the count of the Electoral College to essentially overturn the election by returning or literally rejecting votes." This is coming from a man who stood by Donald Trump through countless allegations and controversies on the campaign trail and as president. This is Donald Trump getting caught with his thumb on the scale, with his hand in the cookie jar, but still, his approval rating never dipped below 30%. I've seen numerous interviews at Donald Trump rallies where people are asked if it's okay to have a dictatorship if he is elected, and it's astonishing how many people say yes, because seemingly anything is okay as long as it's Donald Trump doing it. What is going on here? As a Canadian, I'm terrified of what this could indicate. The fact that upwards of 30 million Americans do not believe the last election was legitimate and that Donald Trump is, quote, the true president, who was cheated out of victory despite the only evidence of fraud having been a phone call made by Donald Trump to election officials in Georgia asking them to, quote, find 11,780 votes, a comment which was recorded by Secretary of State Ben Raffensperger, who felt morally obligated to record the conversation given what Trump was suggesting. Despite all his argumentation and having taken multiple states to court, there's absolutely zero evidence that there was any fraudulent votes counted in the 2020 election. Again, I feel the need to repeat that the only individual who was caught trying to do anything to sway the election was Donald Trump himself and his team members. He has convinced tens of millions of Americans to not trust their democracy. What good can possibly come from this? And how has the Republican Party, full of career politicians, allowed him to stay at the head of the party? Some have said they stayed in his presidency to prevent or dissuade him from making rash, world-changing decisions. So it seems as though there were people who felt morally obligated to cushion the world from the impact of Donald Trump. But this time around, he doesn't have career Republicans so much as he has a team who pledges allegiance to him before the flag. This time around, it doesn't appear there is room in Trump's armor for dissenters, of which he encountered many at the dismal conclusion of his presidential reign. Those who promote him today, they promote the idea that the presidential election was stolen from him, despite absolutely zero evidence of such. Every elected person who shouts his name at rallies and wears MAGA hats are complicit in whatever is to come after November 8th. With these ideas of allegiance to the man being greater than allegiance to democracy, we must wonder about his new vice president, J.D. Vance. a man with a very brief political career and who in 2016 referred to Donald Trump as America's version of a certain German dictator from the 30s and 40s, what are the intentions of J.D. Vance? Since 2016, Donald Trump has remained constant in his beliefs. His behavior and his manner and the way he expresses himself on the political stage has remained absolutely the same as when Vance made those criticisms, but J.D. Vance seems to have done a complete 180 on his stance regarding Trump. There's some intention here, and time will reveal what exactly his intentions are. So what is it that makes people love Donald Trump in both America and Canada? With Trump, it doesn't matter so much if his ideas are good or if he tells the truth. What seems to matter is that he won't judge people who don't feel comfortable with every facet of the current zeitgeist. He won't call someone stupid or hateful unless, of course, they are on the left or among the Republicans who turn their back on him, as many have. There is a degree of mental acrobats people who stand behind Donald Trump will do and are seemingly expected to do in order to support him. This is a point that, in personal experiences, no Trump supporter is willing to touch or push back on, and that is his rejection and attempted coercion of the 2020 election. There are countless millions who will argue over an assertion that Donald Trump lied to them and was largely responsible for inciting violence at the Capitol on January 6th and not using his massive reach to call anyone off until things had begun to ease. This is despite his clear obsession with Twitter at the time. These are seemingly points that don't matter to the people who support Donald Trump today. By far, the most important part of a democracy is accepting the results. You can challenge the results, you can call for a recount, but when it's all said and done, you need to accept the outcome. If you refuse to accept the outcome, which Donald Trump did in 2020 when he lost, and he even did in 2016 when he won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, you are no longer an honest participant in democracy. What worse is there than someone who will not be an honest participant in a democratic election? It is the basis of political stability in the Western world. We might say that the Western world is based on our collective values and it's our freedom, but it's our right to elect leadership which gives us the opportunity to participate in politics and dictate our future. But to many Trump supporters, this rejection of reality, this rejection of the basic tenets of democracy is a mere blemish, something not even worth addressing. They will mention immigration or taxes or inflation or housing. They will argue his policies are simply better and therefore something as meager as refusing to accept the lost 2020 election isn't even worth discussing. As a Canadian, sharing the largest land border in the world with a country which accounts for 80% of our total trade, I'm at the very least nervous of what will come to be this November. I think tens of millions of voters are unwilling to accept the election results if their guy doesn't win, is not what one expects to hear coming up from the United States, but here we are. Our politics are a bit less fashionable, but equally vulnerable to such ideas. To think it can't happen here is a mentality that has caused many countries in the past to fall prey to ill-intended actors, similar to what is taking place in the United States. Good policy is a fine thing to vote for, but if the time comes where our leaders are unwilling to accept elections, we need to recognize it and understand the extent of the harm this idea can cause. A sound budget is important, but knowing we will have another democratic election is more important than anything. After all, there was a certain German dictator who once salvaged a struggling economy, but the rest of his ideas were much worse for everyone. This is not to draw a direct comparison between that man and Trump, but is meant to articulate the severity of failing to recognize the potential damage of someone who will not accept reality on reality's terms. On that dry, gray note, I want to thank you for joining me today. I had to talk about this today because this is something we're all facing in real time. Canada and US relations, as is described by Pierre Trudeau, is like a mouse being in bed with an elephant. So when the elephant starts to move, we have to pay attention. Today's podcast was brought to you from the Multicultural Studios by myself, Matthew Harrison, and Ryan Funk on the soundboard. Thank you again for joining, and I'll talk to you soon from the heart of Canada.